This recording will be up on our cloud site that we have for Amherst 73 Speaks until next year's reunion. So anybody can go and look at any of the interviews at any time between now and then. There'll be a notice that goes out first of all of you who've participated today and then to the whole class. So, okay, with that, I'm going to go ahead and spotlight David. And we're going to spotlight Paul. And I'm going to get my thing minimized here so it's out of the way. And with that, you guys are on, so please go ahead and start.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jim, and welcome to everyone. And welcome especially to Paul, and thanks in advance for doing this. This should be a pretty interesting session. Paul is.
I wouldn't count on that, by the way, Dave, but you know, let's give it a try.
Okay, I've got a pretty good preview. Anyway, as many of you know, Paul is a physician and he's also an inventor of medical devices. He is technically an emeritus professor at Stanford, but he's basically working full-time for this year at least, and who knows how much in the future. He has done a number of things, including many things actually, but including the creation of a center for medical invention, device invention at Stanford that we're going to get into later in the hour. That's become sort of a model for other universities and programs which try to actually create inventors and not just wait until they're born. So speaking of birth, Paul, why don't you tell us a little bit about where you grew up, a little bit about your family, a little bit about your pre-Amherst educational experience.
Sure. I grew up in Minnesota in a suburb of Minneapolis called St. Louis Park, little suburb. Turns out, I don't know, you folks probably know Tom Friedman, the name Tom Friedman. He's a columnist for the New York Times, and he wrote about this little suburb. It's a few square miles, but it turned out he was 2 years behind me in high school, and it turned out the time we went through, that little suburb was kind of an island of great education, and there were quite a few folks in our class. Al Friedman, the senator, was in my class. Tom Friedman a couple years behind, the Coen brothers, the producers, a couple years behind that. So it was an interesting community. There had been a Jewish diaspora from Minneapolis to set up this community, and it was really good educationally. So my parents were middle class. My dad taught at the University of Minnesota, and otherwise a pretty standard Midwest kind of childhood.
And how many siblings did you have, and where were you?
Older brother.
Older brother. So how did you, well, when you were in high school, were you a late bloomer, or had you already blossomed as a pretty outstanding student by then?
I guess I was a strong student early on, but I think that's fair to say.
Great. So how did you get to Amherst?
So my older brother went to Harvard, and I decided I didn't want to go to Harvard or even a big university. Yeah, I see Steve's comment. You had to be a good student to get in. That's true, to Amherst. So I wanted to go to a smaller school. I had, turns out, unrealistic expectations of trying to play soccer. And I thought I had a shot at that at Amherst. I just, one of those things when I toured the college, I just thought, wow, this is fantastic.
So you majored in chemistry, is that correct?
Yeah.
Did you take, Amherst did not have engineering courses. Have you ever taken an engineering course?
No, I'm a complete wannabe in the engineering side of things. I didn't ever do that.
Were you, as a child, were you a tinkerer? Did you, fix your broken household appliances or, take clocks apart, things like that?
Again, no, I'm sort of embarrassed by that. It seems like you should have had that to be an inventor, but I did. One thing I did do a lot of was trying to design houses. I was really fixated on architecture, and I loved designing things and thinking about houses, but no real engineering.
So at Amherst, you were quite unusual, I would say, in that you had two majors, and one of them was a year-long independent study in philosophy. How did that come to be?
Yeah, I got my chemistry requirements finished up in 3 years, and I was thinking about going to medical school. I was pre-med kind of all the way along, and I got interested in kind of the ethics of medicine and just more the humanities side of medicine, and I came across Joe Epstein, the philosophy professor. He did a lot of ethics, and we talked about it, and he suggested, why don't you, dive in, do an independent study sort of focused on ethics and even on medical ethics. And I thought that sounded like a great idea, and it was. I really loved that year.
So did you write a thesis essentially on
Right.
the topic, and what was the topic?
The thesis was called A Relativistic Approach to Medical Ethics. So there's a framework of thinking called ethical relativism that I thought applied particularly well to medical ethics because it embraced different cultural, religious traditions, and so that hadn't been really looked at with a lens of medical ethics before, and so that's what I did for my thesis.
Did you think of pursuing philosophy as a career?
I did actually. I did an internship, an interterm at what was then a brand new medical ethics institute. It's one you may know. It's called the Hastings Institute, the Institute of Society, Ethics, and the Life Sciences. It's become a fantastic place. So I was in their first intern group. And at the end of the month, I sat down with Dan Callahan, who was the director. And by that point, I'd already figured out that I was going to apply to medical schools, but I was thinking hard about it. And so I said to him, I'm really enjoying ethics and philosophy, and I'm thinking maybe I should do that instead of medical school. And he kind of looked over his desk at me and he said, go to medical school. So that's what I wound up doing. He said, you can return to ethics in your gentle years. And so I figure I'm about due.
Are there any teachers or moments, either in or out of the classroom at Amherst that you now look back on as, particularly formative or kind of significant in what your career has become?
I guess a couple things come to mind. In the sciences, we had absolutely terrific in chemistry and biology both. I mean, it was a great place to do pre-med because those courses were incredibly well taught. People that stand out, Dan Sargent in chemistry, who was a troubled character, but an absolutely brilliant teacher. He used to do an entire hour of synthesis on the board just out of his head, which is, just amazing, could fill the board. Henry Yost in biology was an inspired teacher. And then where small college paid off for me, I think, is I experimented a little bit, especially with English classes, and G. Armour Craig I thought was an amazing teacher and got me turned on more to the humanities, which probably is why I wound up being brave enough to do the philosophy thing. So I really, of all of the places I've trained at or studied, Amherst just was amazing in terms of the teaching quality. I mean, everybody knows that who's on this call, but I'm really grateful for having been there.
Yes, many people, including me, were inspired by Armour Craig. He was a pretty amazing teacher. Just actually in passing, as you may have read, the great Leo Marx died at age of 102 a few days ago. Did you ever take a course with him?
I didn't, no. Knew who he was, of course, but.
Anyway, so you have the distinction of actually having gotten 2 fellowships after Amherst. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I applied for 2 fellowships. One was the Caseby, which is a Oxford scholarship, basically. And then the other was a Watson, which is more of a traveling scholarship. I wound up getting both of those, and so went to the Amherst administration and said, look, help me, navigate this. I'm going to choose one of these. What's your advice? And somebody made some calls to both organizations and said they both want you to do both. And I said, how does that work? And they said, well, the Watson is for traveling, and at Oxford you have these long summers off, and you're going to be at Oxford for a couple of years, so do the Watson during the summers. And I struggled with that for a little bit, but I decided that actually that would be kind of perfect, because I wanted to, the Watson I had pitched doing some medical ethics, and then at Oxford I was going to do more philosophy, and so they did kind of fit together, and I ultimately decided to do both.
So what were the, where did you go in your Watson, and what that fellowship is sort of designed to, as I understand it, have people encounter different, multiple cultures in the same year, or I guess in a couple of years in your case. But where did you go and what did you do?
Yeah, I did kind of the yin and yang of medical ethics. So for one summer, I went to the first hospice that was in London. It was called St. Christopher's Hospice. And there's a a woman called Cicely Saunders, who founded the whole concept of hospice care. And so I spent a summer there, kind of at the high end of, medical ethics, if you will. And then the other summer I went to Nigeria and looked at, that was interesting. I wanted to do something in Africa. I picked Nigeria because they were in the middle of a transition of adopting Western style medical care and technologies and so on, and had these amazing sort of issues coming up. I remember visiting an intensive care unit at a fairly rural hospital, and one of the big issues, of course, is termination of life support. If you have too many patients who need ventilators, how do you make that decision of who stays on a ventilator and who doesn't? So I asked the head doc about that, and he sort of smiled ironically. He said, "We don't have that problem." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, every day when the air conditioners come on, we have a power outage. And so those people who make it, and those who don't. That was their solution for the problem." So anyway, that's what I did for the Watson.
Interesting. So you spent two years after college before you went to medical school.
Yeah.
And then you went to Harvard Medical School, did a internal medicine residency, and then a fellowship in cardiology. And you were there in the early years of interventional cardiology. Is that correct?
Yeah, that it was a massive episode of right time, right place in terms of, a whole new field opening up. It was just angioplasty, which is the balloon treatment of the coronary arteries, was just starting to be done. And in fact, I think we have a picture of the guy I wound up being able to work with, who was one of the real pioneers of angioplasty.
Great. Well, yeah. Well, I want to see, have you show some of those pictures in a minute, but talk a little bit about when you first thought that you could actually, come up with a new device. A lot of people have ideas that occur to them. Boy, this could be done better, and this might be a way of doing it better, and that's sort of where it, that's the end of it.
Yeah.
When did you start, and how did you, in particular, start coming up with prototypes for ideas that you had? Did you have a workshop in the basement, and you would come back from 80-hour weeks as a fellow and just go down and start messing around with catheters, or how did that work?
So I got started actually while I was in college. In summers, I worked in a research lab at the University of Minnesota hospitals. And we were doing animal surgery there. And I started having ideas for improving that. And there were great engineers associated with the surgery department. And so I'd, go meet with them, say, how about this thing? And they'd make one, and none of those things were real. They helped us with little problems in our animal surgery. None of those were substantial ideas, I would say. But it did, I guess, teach me that, if you find the right people, just having an idea, which is all I was capable of, was enough. And you could find somebody to do the prototyping, and that, I think, gave me confidence later on when I was a fellow and started having more substantial ideas to seek out engineers and partner with them.
Can you be an inventor and have your contribution be the idea, and all of the hardware and technology and engineering done by someone else?
Yes, but so you can get a patent off of an idea. All the law requires is that you be able to explain it, draw it in a way that somebody, the law says, skilled in the art is able to make that thing. And so you can, just as a clinician or whatever, have an idea, get a patent, and that's good enough. But as you develop that technology and the engineers help to make it, they will invent other pieces of that are important to making the thing actually work. And it becomes a collection of patents, of which yours is the first, but there are lots of others that are enabling.
Interesting. So you have more than 45 patents, but the devices that I guess you're perhaps best known for are two. One is a so-called rapid exchange catheter for coronary, I guess not just for the coronary arteries, but for intravascular, intra-arterial procedures and manipulation. And the other one is a needle with a ultrasound transducer at the end. So it's a kind of a needle with an eye in it.
Yeah, catheter with an eye. Yep.
Catheter with an eye. So, and you brought a couple pictures, which I guess Jim is going to actuate. So why don't you just talk us through these two inventions?
Yeah. Well, we brought pictures because I have a little trouble explaining this, but so this is a guy, John Simpson, who I wound up being lucky enough to work with when I was a fellow, and he invented the first practical system for balloon angioplasty for fixing the coronary arteries. And that on the lower right, there's a picture of the balloon, and then the pressure gauge on the right is exactly what it seems like. It's the thing that puts pressure into the balloon. But let's look up at the X-ray just to get oriented. So this is a heart, and the balloon is between the two bright dots there. It's deflated right now, would be inflated later. And the thing I wanted to draw your attention to is beyond that balloon, there's a guide wire. And that was Simpson's fundamental idea to the arteries in the heart, as you know, are complicated branching structures. And in order to get a balloon down there, you have to first find the right set of branches to go down, a bunch of twists and turns. And the guide wire allowed us to do that. So you put the guide wire down first, and then the balloon catheter rides on top of the guide wire. The balloon catheter is a tunnel, and it slides over the guide wire. So am I okay so far, David?
Yep.
Clear. Okay. So there was a problem with this system. So if you follow me so far, the catheter goes into the patient in the groin, in the femoral artery. There's about 3.5 feet of catheter then inside the patient. But in doing the angioplasty, you want to do several balloons typically. So you go on with a little one, and then you pull that one out and you go in with the next size one. And so you're riding on that guide wire back and forth. And if you can visualize this, to keep the guide wire down inside the heart in the patient, you've got 3 feet of catheter. You need at least 3 feet of that guide wire sticking out of the patient from the groin on back, because you're going to be putting balloons back and forth. Doesn't matter if that wasn't too easy to understand, because the next picture just shows the problem. What that thing I just described to you means is that the way John Simpson's angioplasty system worked required 2 docs to do it. So a nurse and 2 docs. And the second doc, I label it the oops guy. That was the position I was in training. And the job of the oops guy, you're down. So in this scene, the patient's head is away from us. The feet are right towards us here. And the oops guy is positioned at the patient's feet. And he is trying to keep that 10-foot long guide wire from moving any more than 1/4 of an inch. While the doc driving the catheter is moving it up and down and not communicating well. And you've got 2 hands on the catheter, 2 hands on the guide wire. If you hit the next slide, Jim, which turns out to be 2 hands too many. It was an awkward way of doing angioplasty. And I happened to come on the scene when we were just starting to do this, and because I had fresh eyes and because I was getting yelled at for messing this up, I thought there's got to be a better way of doing this. And so what the invention here on the next slide, this is the patent, and I'll walk you through this, and then maybe David, you can help fill in the gaps. But okay, let's look at the top figure, figure 1. So the part in the patient is from number 16 in the right on. Okay, so that's inside the patient. To the left of 16 is outside the patient. All right, and then if we look at the balloon part at 33 there, so the guide wire, which is 28 in this figure, is extending out of the balloon, and the balloon is riding on the guide wire. So inside the patient, the balloon catheter is riding on the guide wire. It's surrounding the guide wire. Okay, let's look outside the patient, way to the left now. Outside the patient, you see the catheter that Jim is indicating is separate from the guide wire. The guide wire here is 27. So just to repeat, inside the patient, the catheter is traveling on the guide wire, but outside the patient, they're side by side. And if you go down to the bottom, those little cross sections, to the right, first of all, it shows you the little guide wire 27 is inside the catheter. To the way left, the guide wire is outside of the catheter. And in the middle is the transition zone where the guide wire comes out. Why does that matter? Well, if you look at the upper left, figure 1, the upper left again, this means that a single doc can do the procedure with 1 hand on the catheter and 1 hand on the guide wire. So it makes it much simpler. And you can use a guide wire that's only 4 feet long because there's only a short section of the catheter riding on the guide wire. So David, I'm going to stop there because I think I see glazed eyeballs. Is there anything that you can fill in to make that more clear?
I think the idea that one person can control both things, and you know your left hand knows what your right hand is doing, and you don't have to be, relaying to another person what to do with one of his hands. I think that's the advantage of that is pretty obvious. Yeah.
So this turned out to, long story short, this turned out to be popular The worst part of this for me was there was a whole bunch of patent litigation around this. I told David, I tallied up, I have 1,900 and some pages of deposition, trial testimony, and so on. But long story short, this patent dominated, and it's now the way that angioplasty and stenting is done using this system. So in the large majority of cases.
Wow.
So that was that one.
Terrific. And this was done when you were essentially in private practice, or you were not an academic physician at this point?
Yeah, it turns out Stanford, in its wisdom, I trained at Stanford, but Stanford, the chief of cardiology didn't think angioplasty was worth much. And so this guy, John Simpson, was in a private hospital, and I left Stanford to go train with him.
Interesting. Great. Okay, tell us a little bit about intravascular ultrasound.
So let's look at the next picture. This is a coronary angiogram. So this is a picture of the arteries in the heart. And where the question mark is, there's a narrowing in the artery. And the problem we had early in angioplasty is that we put a balloon in and dilate, but it just, first of all, a lot of them were coming back, re-narrowing, like 40% were coming back. And the angiogram just wasn't clear enough to tell us whether we had actually finished the dilating or not. And so I'd had a little bit of background in ultrasound, actually, and it occurred to me that if you hit the next slide, Jim, that if we could miniaturize a transducer small enough to, like David said, put an eyeball inside the artery, that would be a way of looking in higher resolution than the X-ray could. And so that's what this picture indicates. The little ray going out in the graphic is the ultrasound sweeping around. And what this gives you is a two-dimensional slice picture of the artery. And we can walk through the central gray disc there is the catheter itself. It's the catheter's image of itself. And then the next circle, that's where the blood is flowing. And those little speckles that you kind of see, those are actually blood cells that you can pick up. And then the next layer is where what we call the plaque is. This is the buildup that causes the trouble in the arteries. This is where the cheeseburgers go. And that next dark stripe is normal wall. And so this is, typical for a coronary artery to have this kind of buildup. So I started a company up around this. We did some preliminary testing and animal testing. Took a couple of years to develop the system. It was hard to miniaturize the ultrasound and get it accurate, but it came time to test it in humans. And I actually, this was the first time I'd done it. So I tried to call the FDA and say, how long is this going to take to get in humans? And it won't surprise you to hear that I didn't get a very precise answer about that. But I had a friend, cardiology friend in Norway. And I was talking to him about this. I called him up and I said, just out of curiosity, what would it take in Norway to do this? And he said, I don't know, let me look into it. So like 2 weeks later, he called me back and he said, it's okay. And I said, what do you mean it's okay? He said, I talked to the guy in the government and he said, sure, come on over and do it. So we threw some catheters into a suitcase and went over to Norway. And on the next slide is the first human intravascular ultrasound image. You'll be forgiven if you can't make much out of this. In fact, when I took this picture back to the chairman of the board of the company, and I showed him proudly the first human image, and he said, "I can't see shit in this image." So it was not exactly thumbs up, but the pictures got better with time. And I actually, I can show you a video of a current picture. If you, there we go.
Stop my sharing and let you start yours.
Okay, let's see if this is going to work. Are you seeing a picture there now?
Looks good.
All right, so this again, this is the catheter. This is where the blood is flowing. You'll see those blood cells in just a second. And here is a kind of crescent of plaque in this artery. Now in this patient, we've already fixed the artery by putting a stent in. And you guys probably know that a stent is a little metal lattice that props open the artery. And it's the main thing we do in arteries now. We've gotten beyond just ballooning and use stents. So what you're going to see here is this catheter is going to start in the area that's upstream from the stent, move into the stent, and you'll see the stent itself. The size of this, this is about soda straw size where the blood is flowing. And this size is a very skinny pasta noodle of some sort. So let's go into real time here. Okay, so there's the blood flowing in the artery. This is the plaque. And now we're just starting to peek into the stent. You see sort of irregularly spaced bright spots. I'll try to stop it in a good spot. Yeah, these are the metal struts of the stent. And the point is, this is a nice now big lumen. This was, before we did the procedure, this was down tight around the catheter. And now we've got, in this stented segment, we've got nice blood flow going through. So that's what it looks like. And we learned a lot about how to put stents in using ultrasound. And now we only use ultrasound when we have a question of how well we've done. So, depends on which country you're in. In Japan, they do this in almost every case. In the US, they do it, kind of 1 out of 5 to 1 out of 10, something like that. They'll be insecure enough that they want to go back in and have a look. So let me get out of stop share here.
Right.
So that's IVUS or intravascular ultrasound.
Right, and you mentioned, Paul, in one of our previous conversations that there's been more than 40 million of the rapid exchange devices used, but only, I say only, about 5 million of the intravascular ultrasound. So it's not like they're used in every procedure.
Right.
Or, when you want to know a little bit more than you can see otherwise. So just moving right along, you eventually created or co-founded this center in 2000 at Stanford, which, as I understand it, is based on the idea that you can go out, or teams can go out and look for places in medicine where a better mousetrap is needed, and then come back and design a better mousetrap. You don't have to wait around for, to be the oops guy and have an aha moment that there's got to be a better way. Or perhaps there is always inspiration, of some sort. But anyway, talk a little bit about the theory behind this Center for Biodesign, the Byers Center for Biodesign, and how it works and what makes it different.
Yeah, well, you hit the headlines. I mean, the idea is that there's a discipline to inventing, and is possible to make smart people into inventors and good inventors into great inventors if you sort of learn this discipline. And the core of the discipline is to really pay close attention to what the clinical need is. So we all are problem solvers. We're all good at it. That's how we, get into places like Amherst. But from in the context of invention, that can lead you to a sort of ready, fire, aim inventing. You want to get to the inventing part because it's fun, and you don't spend enough time thinking about which clinical problem you're going to pursue. It's young inventors especially fall in love too easily with clinical problems. And you see something in the hospital, it's compelling because somebody's suffering from it, and you immediately go into solution mode. And the thing is, with medical technologies especially, it's going to take 5 or 10 years and tens of millions of somebody's money to get that developed, tested through the FDA and so on. So you want to be really, really careful about which problem you choose to work on. And so the way we do that is we front load the innovation process. We form teams. We like teams of 4. These are mixed engineers and physicians who are through their graduate training and are interested in being inventors. And they come to us, and at the beginning of the year, they don't know what area they're going to be working in. So, we'll announce to them on day 1, okay, neurology is your area. Now go live in the hospital and don't come back to us until you have at least 200 problems that you could pursue. So that sounds daunting, right? 200, it's easy. The problems are all over the place. The thing we're trying to do is to slow them down, have them see a bunch of things, and then we filter those problems. So they find 200 needs in 2 months. That's easy. The next 2 months, we put them through a filtering process where we ask them to pick just the top 2 or 3 needs that are most important, cause the most suffering, don't have a competing, evolving, or existing technology to address them, and would have enough of a market to support, going forward. And after they've picked those top 3, the rest is easy. I mean, we give a guarantee that if you pick that need right, you will come up with a good invention. That the inventing part is not the hard part. The hard part is picking the right need and really deeply understanding it.
Really interesting, really interesting. And there's, a lot to talk about there. I will just mention in passing that as of a couple years ago, when you were given a prize by the National Academy of Engineering, 47 companies had been created by the trainees, the fellows in this program, while they were fellows, as I understand. More companies started after they left. And 30 CEOs of medical device companies are graduates of your program, as I understand it. One of the things that I found most interesting, though, in your presentation, when you accepted that award, is the question of, as better mousetraps are found, and I guess to mix metaphors, more things, more problems that are addressable are recognized in medicine. There's more targets to go after. there's more drugs, there's more devices, there's more procedures. All of these cost money. And if you chart out medical spending, there's the kind of ridiculous conclusion of these extrapolations that 92% of the GDP will be spent on healthcare, in 100 years. It's obviously not going to happen. But the uncontrolled costs of medical healthcare spending is a sort of Malthusian specter that the solution of which is not obvious. And you noted in your talk that, I'm quoting approximately correctly, we haven't paid enough attention to cost. There's no reason we can't make cost effectiveness the need we innovate around, which is a really interesting idea. Instead of finding a solution just for a medical problem, you're talking about inventing to find a solution to an economic problem. So in just a couple of minutes before we get to the questions, address that Malthusian specter and how you're going to invent to cost effectiveness and perhaps solve it.
Yeah. Well, that was a great summary, and it's a huge problem, needless to say. If you asked 100 healthcare economists, what's the single most important factor driving the escalation of healthcare costs, 100 of them would say the introduction of new technologies is the thing that's driving costs. So it's urgent to do exactly as you said, to do economic needs finding. And we're in the middle of trying to develop a methodology that we can train our folks to do that kind of needs finding. So what does that look like? Well, we're looking for kind of practical tips. And the one example is if you look at the trajectory of cost of a particular medical condition, there's a place where it just skyrockets. That place is on admission to the hospital. And that causes costs to go crazy. So one area to look at is how to prevent admission or delay admission. Can you treat better outside of the hospital? And so a lot of what we do is looking at that, early diagnosis, and also taking care of things outside of the hospital. The same applies for who is providing the service. So if you can shift the care from a specialist to a generalist, in our system, you save money. If you can shift it from a generalist to a nurse, you save even more money. And if you can shift it from a nurse to home, that's the best thing of all. So these are some of the signposts that we're looking at. One of the products that came out that some of our trainees did a few years ago, some of the clinicians on the screen will know this one. So if you have heart rhythm problems, what we used to do is the internist would refer those to cardiologists, and the cardiologists would refer them to electrophysiologists to get a special recording of the heart rate. So what this team of trainees said is, look, that's expensive. It takes a long time. Let's enable the internist to do this. And so they invented a smart bandage, basically, that records your heartbeat. An internist can prescribe it, patient puts it on, and the 2-week recording is read in the cloud. So it bypasses the cardiologist, bypasses the electrophysiologist, and only those patients who have real severe rhythm problems have to see the specialist. And so that takes a lot of cost out of the system. And that one was driven by a combined attention to economics and the clinical need.
Really interesting, really interesting. Okay, well, I'm going to turn it over to Jim, and I haven't checked to see if there's questions, but I assume that there probably are some. So Jim, why don't you read them or call on people?
All right. Well, actually, we've got only one question specifically, which I asked at the very beginning here. So I'm going to encourage people to think about them for a moment. As I said before, you can use your hand down here to raise it. You can see it in my little cell right now. And anyways, I'll start with the question I started with. The Stanford model for innovation support that you've mentioned, and I think you may have answered this, David, in one of your comments. I want to know when it actually got created and institutionalized.
Yeah, we just celebrated our 20th year. So it was 2000, 2001 that we got going. And it was a slow start. We're a little more robust now and got an endowment to become a center, which is great news because it means the university is willing to keep us around for a while.
How many people do you actually have employed there?
Well, there are layers of numbers. So our core sort of faculty group includes some part-time. So we have a lot of clinicians. So some of them are part-time, 20, 30% with us. So that number is 40. But we draw sort of shamelessly from Silicon Valley in terms of people out in industry who are experts at engineering or patent law. And so that's an additional 150 people who help us out in some form of teaching or mentoring. Good.
Here's a question from David Downs. I want to know if blockages in the arteries greatly varied in size, or can most stents be about the same size?
They're different sizes, and that's part of the art, is to figure out, how big the vessel is at that point where you're going to put in a stent, and then how much it actually can be expanded, and so that's a fair part of the struggle in figuring out how to do the procedure.
Okay, very good. All right, I see Mr. Scheinman has his hand up. So Steve, go ahead.
Well, first of all, am I muted? Can you hear me?
No, you're good. You're good. Go ahead, talk.
Paul, it is great to see you, first of all, and to hear firsthand about what we've known about for years from your contributions. But when going back to when Dan Callahan told you to go to medical school,
yeah,
that smile on your face, you're telling that story, suggested something that I'm sure is not the case, which is that he thought you would not do as well as medical ethicist. I suspect he was really saying that season yourself as a physician, get the experience with patients and in certain situations, then you'll have more credibility as an ethicist. So now with 5 decades as a physician, in particular, with the scientific advances that you have developed, have those raised any ethical issues that you needed to face, or leave it at that.
So I would say what comes to mind as the biggest issue is, as you know, there was over exuberance about doing these coronary procedures. They paid us well as practitioners. I think one of the things I liked about the intravascular ultrasound was that it was a little bit of a truth teller, and there have been lawsuits around doctors performing inappropriate angioplasties where the ultrasound was used as evidence that things weren't as bad as the docs were thinking that they were. So, I think I've been a part of an industry that is driven by financial return and not purely by what's good for patients. And that to me is the biggest ethical issue. And honestly, it's I have to defend the med tech industry. I think we're a little better than pharma in this respect, but it's an issue.
Okay, very good. Steve Klugman has a hands-free question. Steve, go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Steve.
Just a little off the point, but what you were saying now, I think comes a little closer. I've had a couple of conversations over the years with my cardiologist that I'll try to lump together and ask you what you think about that. And he's a guy he's even older than we are, but he's been around for a long time. And said he gets concerned about some of these procedures, and it was probably angioplasty because that's what I've had, becoming so routine that people are less concerned about heart health because they've had or they know people who, well, we fix that with an angioplasty. And that seems to me that raises a couple issues when you were sort of talking about it, has to do with the expense and our dealing with the widespread and in some instances unavoidable problem of coronary difficulties by putting people in the hospital rather than having them live lives that might keep them out of the hospital. But also he thought that as I understood you were saying, it may have a tendency to weaken people's resolve to avoid, if people like me with genetic predispositions might weaken their resolve to not make them worse. And I'm curious what you think of that, and more generally, how are we doing with all the medical advances? How are we doing at, there's obviously a lot of attention to it, but as a society, keeping people away from these procedures and out of the hospital by having them do the things that I think by now we all know we're supposed to do, or not do the things we all know we're not supposed to do. Are we getting better? Are we getting worse? Are we staying about the same?
Yeah, so first of all, I have to say it's not an area I'm expert in terms of getting the statistics exactly right. But in general, as you know, heart disease has been decreasing as a proportion of what ails us and kills us. So that's been good news. We have seen most of the benefit of that, and most of the benefit of that had to do with smoking reduction. One of our other classmates had a big role in that. But now it's leveled off, and it really is the healthy lifestyle, compliance with exercise, compliance with medications is the biggest intractable problem that we've had. There is a little bit, back to technology, I'm a little bit encouraged, I have to say, with digital health approaches and the social networking around those that's being exploited by diabetes management companies and so on. That looks like it's starting to move the needle to me. There are probably people on this call that are more expert than I am, but it has to be sort of psychology based. It has to be something that really affects our psychology, and it feels like the good side of the Facebook phenomenon could help us here.
Good.
Thank you, and thank you both, Paul and Dave, for that program. I think I learned some things.
We have a question from Stephen Keith. He says, how do you reconcile the use often beyond their indication of new technologies with the significantly higher cost of these clinical interventions? For
Well,
example,
actually, I think that Paul's already answered those. It's interesting that we are focusing on cost versus benefit
yeah,
of new interventions. So I think, yeah, I'm maybe you want to answer it a third time, Paul, but it's up to you.
or you can ask a follow-up question, Stephen.
Yeah, you were hoping I'd get it right this time. Is that? I don't think I have anything smart to say about that. It just, affordability is a crisis.
Yeah, and well, I will follow up with something. I mean, we are finding more and more, because I think we're asking the questions about different effects, both in terms of benefit as well as risks in different subgroups, racial and ethnic subgroups, men versus women, et cetera. Is this something that's going to continue, or are we going to continue to learn from this? Because I'm also involved in clinical research, and there are some companies that are developing new products that really don't care about differences. What's your view on this?
My instinct is that it's really important, and we're seeing more and more the personalization and the group differentiation. I just heard a grand rounds this morning taught me something I wasn't aware of, which is the profound difference in men and women for response to traumatic brain injury, concussions. Big differences, probably with important implications for how, helmets should be designed and so on. So I think we're just starting to crack this. And a lot of those, the other thing that's really important here is, as you know, we generally don't have good data for underserved populations. I mean, it's really tough to get hold of accurate data to invent with in those populations. It's a huge problem.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that with the direction that we're heading, with ever more personalized medical solutions and genetics, for instance, that we can't help but be moving towards more and more differentiation of treatment, some of which would have identity-related profiles, but most of which may be more genetically related, more functional individuals' backgrounds. Okay, we're a little past 3 o'clock. I'm certainly happy to, 3 o'clock West Coast, I'm certainly happy to leave this open for people if you'd like to talk a little bit longer. Again, I thank both Paul and David for a great set of interview discussions. And thank you very much. David, do you have any concept about when the next one of these might be? Is it going to be 3 or 4 months or?
Yeah, they're roughly every 3 months. So I guess 3 months from now, and we're gonna, not take a break in the summer. We're just gonna keep going around. Yeah, so
Okay.
about 3 months from now, we'll announce probably, a month before it, who it's going to be, and then you'll get the usual, late breaking reminders. But
yeah, so again, just to remind everybody, we're doing about a half a dozen of these leading up to our reunion next May of 2023. We certainly hope to see everybody there in person, but in the meantime, this will hopefully generate some connections and some interest among our classmates. Okay, so I'm going to turn off the formal part of the interview then right now, David, unless you've got something more you'd like to say.
I don't think we have to extend it since there aren't any more questions, but I want to thank Paul in particular. A really interesting discussion, I think, and I'm sure that the listeners will concur. And Jim, thank you once more for running the show.
My pleasure. So
Thanks,
I'm gonna
guys.
leave it open again if people want to socialize for a few minutes. Stay on the chat. Nice to see everybody. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks, everybody.